A very warm welcome on behalf of Radboud Reflect and Europel. For those of you who don't know Europel stands for EU Politics, Administration and Law, and is a hotspot here at Radboud University that does interdisciplinary research on these topics. My name is Bas van Wilgenmaroker, and I'll be the moderator for this session. So the EU has categorized China as a partner for cooperation, an economic competitor, as well as a systemic rival. Now, these three things, the way that the EU has categorized China, might seem a bit contradictory. So one of the questions that we'll be looking at tonight is, well, how can these three ways of categorizing another power bloc be, how can they coexist, and can they coexist? At the same time, the EU is very much dependent on China, for instance, when it comes to technology and rare earth elements that are vital for the green energy transition. So there's a very real tension between this dependency, but also the necessity to get these materials for the green energy transition. It's also a topic that we'll be discussing this evening. But at the same time, the EU is increasingly worried about this dependency. And that is for multiple reasons. That's because there might be supply chain risks, but also other security risks. And the EU now aims for more autonomy, more independence, and the official strategy is to de-risk instead of decouple. So, but what does this de-risking mean? What does it mean to de-risk? Is it possible to de-risk? And not unimportantly, what's China's perspective on all of these developments? Because we'll not only be looking at what's the EU stance on this relationship, but also what is China's stance on this relationship. And we're going to discuss these and more questions with three speakers from Radboud University. We're actually starting with the first question. So what is China's perspective on this relationship with Guangyu Qiao-Franco? Guangyu is an assistant professor of international relations here at Radboud University, and she's an expert in China studies, cybersecurity, and AI, among a lot of other subjects. Guangyu will start with a lecture of about 20 minutes discussing this perspective. After Guangyu's lecture, we'll be listening to Angela Wigger. She's also an assistant professor, associate professor, also of international relations, that is correct. She specializes in the political economy of global capitalism. She will also give a lecture of about 20 minutes after Guangyu. And after that, we'll be joined in the discussion with Bart Jacobs. Bart Jacobs is a professor of computer security, privacy, and identity, and his works cover security, privacy, intelligence, law, and ethics. So as I said, Bart will join for the discussion. In the end, there will be room for your questions. So if you have any questions, please wait for them until the end. I think that's all for now. Please, a very warm welcome for Guangyu.
Good evening, everyone. And also thank you, Bas, for the kind introduction. It's my very first time to actually attend this Radboud Reflects event. It's a great pleasure to be here and also be part of this important conversation on EU-China relations. Before I begin, I want to make a small disclaimer about my own expertise and perspective. So my research focuses a lot on technology politics, technology governance. So you will see me drawing a lot of examples from the technological domain, especially those related to AI, digital governance, export controls, and so on. And also I work quite closely on Chinese policy debates and strategic thinking. So tonight that I will be focusing on explaining the Chinese perspective, and I will mostly leave the European side of the story to my colleagues Angela and Bart. But I do think that it's really important to have this better understanding of a Chinese perspective if we really want these serious conversations about EU-China relationship, and then to understand that how Chinese policymakers interpret European actions, right? And then why some policies make more sense in its own historical and political context. So that's what I want to begin with, is to give you a sense of China's size or scale in relative to EU. And then because I think it's necessary, because I have talked to many of my colleagues, friends around about China, and then I got the impression that China was often simply took as just another Russia, right? But then China is vastly bigger. Its economy is 10 times the size of Russia. And then also if you look at GDP, so this is a nominal GDP here, and its economy is comparable to the whole EU. And then if you look at the PPP, purchasing power parity, and then it is 1/3 larger than the EU. And its population is double the size of Europe. So this really matters because you are not really talking about an emerging economy that are trying to integrate into this Western-led international order. It is already a pure economic and technological power, which is able to shape international politics and global markets. With that in mind, and then I want to show you that two important developments that really capture this changing EU-China relationship. The first one would be this increasing German or firms' investment in China, despite all the talks about decoupling and then de-risking. And it's the Germany's investment in China reaches this 4 years high. And then second one, it's also happened quite recently. Spanish Prime Minister visited China just for the fourth time in 2026 alone. And then he was there to ask for more economic collaboration, right? And then also for investment, technology transfer. What's interesting is that you really see this major transformation in Europe's logic in engaging with China. So it used to go to China for market access, for cheap labor, and also lower manufacturing costs and many other reasons. But now it is there to access technology, and then also for investment. And I also have had a very interesting conversation with a German governmental official recently, and one of her comments really stayed with me. And then she told me that now it is necessary, for German firms actually to stay within China, to stay updated on technologies. Right? And then they are there to observe this latest technology development, also this manufacturing automation, and then industry organization, and so on. That's just how this reversed relationship is occurring right now. And also I want to show you some important trade data. This first one that is from Financial Times, and then this table is compiled based on OECD data. And then you can see China's dominance in market shares of many areas, including solar panels, shipbuilding, steel, aluminum, many critical minerals. And then also, of course, there are many other areas not even included in this table. What you often see in the headlines would be, for example, energy, EVs, electric vehicles. And then from the data I checked that in 2026, China's market share of EVs is hovering around between 56% to 61%, depending on the data set. You just can see the dominance in increasing more and more areas. And I also want to show you many interesting areas that China is developing, and then which do not even exist in Europe. The first one example I'll give you would be this low attitude economy. I wonder that if it's the first time for many of you to even heard of this term. I'm just happy to explain a bit more. So low attitude economy now is definitely one of the key strategic areas that China is investing in, and then it's even seen as one of the key driving forces for its economy in the coming years or decades. So low attitude economy refers to this commercial and industry activities in the aerospace, usually below this 1,000 kilometers. So for commercial planes, they usually fly at altitudes between 9 9 to 13 kilometers. So refer to this space in that area. And then, so what China is using this space for is for example, autonomous deliveries. And then also for passenger transportation. You can see on the second picture, I think would be your right-hand side, this example of a flying taxi, and then in China, and then also many other purposes, for agricultural modernization, and then also for some infrastructure inspection. For example, you go there to check the wind turbines and so on. So to develop this economy, you do not only need these advanced technologies, drones, helicopters, and so on. You also need these corresponding legal and administrative systems. So, for example, that major cities, and then they are developing laws to regulate who has the right to use that urban space, right? And then also relevant air traffic management systems, and then also what the technical standards you have to meet in order to fly in that space, relevant noise cancellation management strategies, and then also the local governments also need to invest in relevant infrastructure for landing and then also for charging and so on. So as a result of this, many of technological breakthroughs, and then this is what the EU is facing now. That is a large trade deficit. If you look at this figure, again, that on your right-hand side, and then the blue line represents the amount of imports from China, and then the pink line represents the amount of exports. And then it's very easy to tell that this is quite a large deficit. I think the number would be around 360 billion euros every year. And then also exactly what the EU, imports from China. I think you probably also got the impression that mainly these low value added cheap goods, but that's not really the case. And you can look at this figure on this side. This dominant the trade would be some high-end equipment, telecommunication equipment, right? And then also machinery, electronics, and also somehow baby carriages there. I don't know why. They're one of the mainly trade goods between EU and China. So, of course, that the European leaders, and I imagine that all of you are not so happy about this trade deficit. Then what is more interesting would be how this deficit has been explained by the EU, and then also in other words, like how do they understand this China's, becoming this economically more dominant and technologically more advanced? Recently, I went to an event in The Hague, and then so it's called a Reconnect China, then where this EU ambassador to China also gave a speech. And then he gave some reasons that are on this question, right? And then I want to unpack them one by one because I assume that his views should already represent these general assumptions within Europe. And then you can also see that whether it's a fact or fake. The first one, China is ahead because it's good at stealing technologies. Then, so espionage, industry espionage exists, cyber espionage exists. But however, that is just only part of the story because not many countries are involved in espionage. This is just not unique to China. It's not really a secret, right? And also, you cannot really steal this technology innovation. And when the technology is don't even exist in other parts of the world. That's why I give you an example of the low-altitude economy. There are also many other areas, technologies that do not exist in the West. You cannot simply steal them. And then second reason, because of false technology transfer. Again, that there's some truth to it, because I would say in certain sectors, right? And then when European and also other foreign companies went to China, they were required to form joint ventures and then or to transfer technological knowledge in exchange for market access. But there are two things missed in the discussion. So first one, no one forced you to go there. Right? And these companies made their strategic calculations and then to go there to tap these enormous market opportunities. And then also, many developing countries require the same technology transfer. Only China developed this globally competitive economy, right? And then, so what matters is really not only this technology transfer, but also how you observe it, right? And also improve on it, scale it, and commercialize it in order to really pull ahead. The next part, China's economy is a state-driven, state-led, purely top-down, and then it's had because of a lot of government subsidies and lower the cost, and then therefore China just dumping these products in these Chinese, in European markets. Then there's just also some truth to that, right? And then the government is essentially very essential in this industry policy, and then this is also the case for many other developmental states, Korea, Singapore, Japan, and then also many European countries are also subsidizing many critical strategic industries here. But then again, that the subsidies is not enough because there's just hundreds of thousands of companies within China. Not every single of them can access subsidies, right? Then what matters would be that how you actually access those subsidies and compete. It's a very cut-through environment, and then even many companies, they access subsidies and then still have to operate at very thin margins, go through very rapid innovation cycles to survive. And then what matters would be really that a competitive market. That's often ignored in the discussion. And then next point about different values. China is able to charge ahead because no rights protections or no rules, no environmental standards. This is also kind of quite an outdated view, I would say. It's true that China did prioritize this economic development, poverty alleviation, and then for many years. But also now it's rapidly catching up in environmental protection and labor rights, and also privacy protection, and so on. And then, for example, that China now is the largest carbon emitter, but also it is the largest investor in green technology, EVs, batteries, and the green infrastructure, and so on. And then also labor rights. It is just rapidly catching up in enforcing these labor protection rules and also work safety regulations. And it is especially doing well in protecting the most vulnerable people in the society, right? And then, so for example, recently a law issued to specifically protect these food delivery workers from algorithms, the predatory algorithms, and then also in providing this social housing and then social insurance to those vulnerable group of people. So to talk about this, because I think that if you this kind of assumptions decide your policy towards China, right? And then if these concerns, they are legitimate, they are really there. But however, if you think they are sufficient explanations for China's rights, then you really miss China's real strengths. So its rise is not incidental, and then it's not sudden. It's also not because outcome of unfair practices, but a result of these decades of investment in its innovation capacity. So in this human capital and the infrastructure in R&D. I just want to give you two quick examples again. In human capital, China produces more STEM graduates every year than all Western countries combined. then yeah, it does have a large population. But what's more important is a government that's actually willing to invest in this education sector, in R&D, and also sending students overseas to learn from the best. And then also second one, the infrastructure building. I focus on here, the power systems. And then you might wonder that, why it matters. And then we all need electricity in our daily lives. And then also this essential to, for example, many technology development, AI especially, you need electricity to run these data centers, right? And then for EVs, and then of course you need to charge the EVs. And then you may also have come across news about how these American big tech or Meta, how to build their own power generation or transmission systems in order to build these their data centers, right? And then, but Chinese companies can already leverage the infrastructure that was built there for the long term, and then proceed with the production at a much lower cost. And then there's nothing glamorous about this path. Right? And then I'm showing you this photo of J10. This is one of these already older models of China's fighter jet. It's the newest model would be, I would see, G20, and then just the older one. But it's already caught attention because it was used in the recent India-Pakistan conflict. And then Pakistan used this J10 and then to shoot down a few French and American fighter jets. And then this was developed by this group of people that you see on the screen. You probably notice that the holes on their clothes, right? And then you can imagine these very harsh research conditions. So this took this group of people 25 years, right? And then from 1980s and then to early 2000 to develop this fighter jet. And then so they endured decades of isolation, scarcity, hardship to get there. So the question now is that whether Europe can also endure this hardship, right? And then to also plan strategically, and then invest smartly, and then build your R&D capabilities in order to return to also a leading position. So finally, some words on this Chinese policy towards the EU as required by BUS. And then I would say that China still perceives the EU, Europe, as a very important trading partner. Right, and then still as a key source of advanced technology investment. But of course, there are some concerns within in Beijing regarding Europe, mainly regarding this fragmentation within the EU. I still remember the times that when I was involved in organizing this EU-China expert dialogues on AI, and then just what puzzled this Chinese side is that, who should we invite? Should we actually engage this European level more, or actually the member states, right? And then so just they don't even know who to engage with. And then also the second part of this concern that Europe is actually becoming closer to the United States, especially after the beginning of the Ukraine war. So finally, I would say its future policy towards the EU depends on this strategic autonomy. So I mean that this ability, to what extent that the EU can actually acquire its own military, industry, scientific capabilities as an independent third power, rather than just simply following the US in balancing China. So I think probably around the time. Okay, yeah, I'm going to stop there. And if you have any questions regarding the talk, I'm happy to address them in the Q&A. Thank you.
I need a pointer. Thank you. Oops. So I think I just have to wait until my presentation. Is somebody there? Because I can't. Oh, I do have to click. I have to click. Where do I have to click? Stop and then play. But how do I do that? Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Perfect. And then, yeah. Okay, EU industrial policy for whom? I'm going to talk about shareholder capitalism, subsidizing investors, and the China myth while the planet is on fire. 2 years ago, Mario Draghi, that's the former president of the European Central Bank and also former Prime Minister of Italy, he presented a report in September or October, I can't remember, on the future of European competitiveness. And he argued that the EU was facing a slow agony of economic decline, falling behind major competitors like China and the US. And to counter this, massive investment was needed. Just for scaling up net zero by 2030, it should be more than 1 trillion a year. And for closing the competitiveness gap, investments should go up by a quarter, like up to reaching 5 trillion a year. Just prior to the Draghi report, 70 industry leaders from steel, chemicals, pharmaceuticals gathered in Antwerp and demanded an emergency industrial policy and massive investment, including also the de-risking of private investment. The Antwerp gathering has become an annual ritual, and this year, in February, not 70, but 1,300 industry leaders came together. And the geometry is telling. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she is not invited to deliberate and to listen. No, she's summoned to report on the progress she has booked since the last Antwerp Declaration. And what I find interesting about the Antwerp Declaration is that China is not framed as a geopolitical rival. It is rather being framed as a primitive competitive benchmark that needs to be matched by the EU. So we have, in Europe, we have industries that are simultaneously complaining about too much and too little China. Industries take a different position. On the one hand, since Trump's tariffs blocked a lot of Chinese exports, this is now flooding the EU. And as we've just heard, I mean, Chinese manufacturers, they have moved more in a structural sense ahead of global value chains. They're good in solar, in batteries, in microeconomics, in AI, in robotics, and increasingly also military equipment. And China accounts for 1/3 of all global patent applications. So this means that 1/3 of the German exports are now being threatened by Chinese competitors. This really affects a big industrial economy like Germany. And just go to a parking lot, count the number of BYDs, and don't forget to count Volvo, MGs, and the Lotus, which are also Chinese-owned car companies. So at the moment, 1 out of 10 cars is coming from China in Europe. Soon it will be 1 out of 6. But this does not mean that the car industry is taking a unified stance and wants to have more protectionist tariffs or countervailing duties, whatever. Volkswagen is selling more cars in China than anywhere else. So, and what we've just heard, a lot of industries, I'm not going to repeat that, are structurally dependent on Chinese rare earths and critical raw materials. But the position of industry differs. So it looks maybe like a geopolitical rivalry between states is in fact an intra-EU, intercapitalist competition between different fractions of capital with different stakes. And China is very often taken as an alibi or a pretext for subsidies, for deregulation, for loosening competition rules, for reducing wages and environmental standards, and for nationalizing public procurement so that it favors EU companies only. And the EU's official framing, Bas has alluded to that in his introduction, is also testimony to this division. The EU is simultaneously a cooperation partner, economic competitor, and a systemic rival. And we've also heard that the concept that the EU is handling as its industrial policy program, open strategic autonomy. It's open for those who need access to Chinese markets and autonomy for those who need protection from China. So it's a flexible formula. It is a sort of a legitimization narrative that is deliberately kept vague to serve contradictory interests. And as a common denominator, industrial capital asks for more investments. And the EU does echo this. So we can see that the European Commission talks about extreme underinvestment. The European Investment Bank talks about an investment crisis. And they're not wrong, because investment has been going down in Europe, in the OECD. If you look at gross fixed capital formation, it has fallen since the 1970s. And note the downward slope. But what is striking is the Draghi report, 400 pages. It identifies China's state-sponsored competition. It's presented as a sort of external shock at something that happened to Europe and now needs to be corrected. But there's no analysis of how we got there and why, and that's very important, European industries are not investing. Deindustrialization did not begin when China started to outcompete European companies. It began when China opened its borders and when India liberalized and when the Soviet bloc opened up to the global labor market. We have seen in 2 decades that the global labor force doubled from 1.5 billion to 3 billion. And this was a windfall, not for workers, for capital. Manufacturing was offshored to places where labor was cheap and docile, environmental standards permissive, and in the case of China, where forced labor was available. Let's not forget the Uyghur forced labor that is embedded in the solar panel, in the clothes that we're wearing, in the components of our cars. Uyghur forced labor is running through the supply chain of the biggest international brands. But the logic is simple. I mean, you cannot offshore your manufacturing base and to access cheap labor and then be surprised when Chinese producers catch up. The China shock, as it is often called, is just the invoice. So when the 2008 crisis hit, investment went down. Europe was deindustrializing at an accelerated pace. So basically, what happened? The EU responded with austerity to the crisis, which killed the appetite for investments. And the very same institutions are demanding now trillions of public money, speak taxpayers' money, to fill the investment gap. Taxpayers already had to pay or come to the rescue a decade ago when they had to bail out the financial sector. And they got austerity in return, and now we are facing a different crisis, but the same logic returns. And fact is, there is no shortage of capital. The European Central Bank, under this very same leadership of Mario Draghi, who drafted the competitiveness report, has pumped historically unseen liquidity into corporate bond markets. The ECB was buying bonds, corporate bonds, not only from secondary, but also from primary markets, directly at company level. The beneficiaries were not the green startups or the infant tech industries. No, Volkswagen, Shell, Eni, BASF, Heineken, as well as Moët Chandon, Hennessy Cognac, Louis Vuitton. The fossil fuel core and the luxury brands. Not a wind farm, but bloody handbag empires. This quantitative easing by the ECB was an industrial policy, but not that anybody voted for. And what did corporations do with the cheap money infusion? They did not invest in production. They did not invest in research and development or the green transition or paying out higher wages or ensuring that the human rights and conditions in their supply chain was ensured. They bought back their own shares and paid out to shareholders. Mind you, Share buybacks were illegal in the until the early 1980s in the US. They're not geared towards production or anything remotely close to job creation. They merely inflate stock prices and with them the bonuses of the CEOs and the CFOs who authorize them. In the Netherlands, shareholder remuneration has increased by 500% over the past 20 years. Corporations have become ATMs for shareholders. Look at the signatories of the Antwerp Declaration: Shell, Total Energy, BASF, ArcelorMittal, Mercedes-Benz. Corporations that should be at the center of decarbonization of European capitalism and that have redirected sometimes more than 100% to their shareholders. They've been borrowing money to pay out dividend payments. The same corporations that have lobbied actively against climate action since the 1970s are now in Antwerp demanding public money, speak taxpayers' money to face the green transition and to keep up with the Chinese competition. Chinese companies, they're also listed in Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Wall Street, Nasdaq, you name it. But very often the Chinese state is the dominant or controlling shareholder and profits tend to be reinvested rather than being extracted. So the hollowing out of European industry is not done in Beijing. It's not made in China. It happens in the boardrooms, in the shareholder meetings, quarter by quarter, share by share buyback, dividend payment by dividend payment, while the regulators stand aside and look. We live in the age of rentier capitalism, and shareholder capitalism is just one example of rentierism. And I would like to bring in the friendly old man with a beard, who wrote in Grundrisse in the 19th century, "There are even phases in the life of modern nation when everybody is seized with a sort of craze for making profit without producing. This speculation craze recurs periodically and reveals the true nature of competition." But okay, how is the EU catering for the demands by industrial capital? When China and India launched major industrial programs around 2014 and 15, the EU also adopted a whole range of communication, action plans, acts, and green deals. And very often they cross-cut many DGs. There's not like one website where you can go to and look like, what are the EU industrial policies? It's like one big labyrinth. But they come with the air of inducing a European industrial renaissance. They promise backshoring, onshoring, manufacturing capacity in areas of geo-economic importance. They come with the air of decoupling global production chains and reducing geopolitical dependencies. And the goal is to eventually strengthen intra-EU value chains so that EU goods can be exported as made in Europe. And this raises the question of how this is being financed, all this investment. And the question is pertinent, because the EU budget is extremely small. It's the size of the budget of Denmark, a country of 6 million people. The EU cannot run a budget deficit. It cannot take on debt. That's prohibited by the treaties. So deficit spending, like in the US, is not an option. The EU also has no meaningful taxing powers to increase the revenue. It can also not make tax concessions to corporations. And we should always keep in mind the context of the excessive deficit procedure under the revised Stability and Growth Pact that undergirds the Eurozone. Fiscal leeway of the member state is limited, meaning that the EU and its member states lack the fiscal firepower of its major competitors. So what does the EU do? The EU has adopted so-called risk capacity schemes. And look at the name, InvestEU. It says it all. The EU does not invest. It's not EU Invest. But the EU did. It has made a budget reservation that backs up private and public investments. In the case of defaults or unrealized profits, the InvestEU guarantee kicks in and absorbs a part of the investor losses. And if profits are being made, they stay with the investor with no strings attached. The idea is that using public money will trigger the risk appetite for financial investors to make investments that they otherwise would not do. And this should ultimately lead to a multiplier effect. So 1 public euro guaranteed or spent should trigger miraculously to 15 euros of additional investment, sort of magic money tree idea. I will spare you the details how it works. I know all about it if you're interested. But what it boils down to is socializing the risks, privatizing the profits. Guarantees are a subsidy to financial capital. Can be commercial banks, angel investors, venture capital, private equity, insurance companies, pension funds, you name it. Everything that looks like money, smells like money. InvestEU is detached from any strategic EU policy. As long as there is some investment somewhere, InvestEU has fulfilled its purpose. And look at the different shades of green. That suggests that the EU is mobilizing billions of euros for the green transition. But only 30% of the guarantees need to fall in the EU's green taxonomy, a taxonomy that has been compromised at the outset because it also involves natural gas and nuclear technology, and you name it. It also means 70% of the EU budget guarantees can be used for investors investing into fossil fuel or adjacent industries or defense contractors, anything basically. So in contrast to the Chinese state, the EU does not steer where to invest, but is outsourcing the pace and the direction of the investments, whether green or not green, to the willingness of investors to invest. If a project is not considered bankable, there's no investment, which runs totally counter the purpose of using public guarantees for investments that otherwise would not happen. So InvestEU, it's just one of the many EU industrial policies, is a market-driven neoliberal supply-side mechanism. Public resources are subordinated to the investment criteria and the profitability logics of private financial capital. And I just want to have one example and then I will round off. InvestEU sponsors venture capital funds. And I take this figure back home. Nearly 40% of all investments into European Venture Capital Fund is public money. The European Investment Fund, which is a private-public hybrid, is the single largest investors in venture capital. What does venture capital actually do with these investments? They invest in startups with a purpose, to sell them at a profit. 9 out of 10 portfolio companies usually fail. The one that survives is systematically overvalued. It has to, because you have to compensate the losses. And they all exit. They sell the company or float it on the stock market. Now, it happens that European capital markets are not deep. Private equity, venture capital, these are saturated markets. That's why private equity is investing in music festivals and the like. That's just an indicator of that. So, but what we see is that a big chunk of EU-subsidized deep tech and clean tech companies end up on Wall Street. They're bought up by US private equity, where the appetite for overvalued asset is higher. Follow the logic. Public money goes into venture capital funds. Venture capital funds invest in European startups, and those startups exit in the United States. The EU is using public money to sponsor the outflow of the very companies it is claiming to build. To conclude, we are in a climate emergency. EU industrial policy creates an illusion of climate action while leaving the decarbonization of capitalism untouched. This is an act of procrastination at the expense of the planet. At the same time, EU member states are cutting healthcare, education, housing, while channeling unconditional public money into corporations that pay it out to shareholders and increasingly also into defense industries. And a large chunk of this is financed with debt. Debt to pump up the economy has an ecological footprint. To service debt, economies must grow, and growth is not free from emissions. The question is, how much more debt can we afford within our planetary boundaries? So, but just using the climate and China as a pretext, we are currently pumping significant amounts of public money into financial sectors players with a pure profit motive. We're asking them to invest in industries which themselves are not investing, but prioritizing shareholder wealth or end up on Wall Street. And just to end with Ursula von der Leyen, basically when competitiveness and climate goals collide, competitiveness wins. She says that the EU will do everything it can, mind you, Mario Draghi, whatever it takes, to support European industries in winning the race for leading green technology value chains. I don't hear her saying like the EU does everything it takes to decarbonize capitalism.
Yeah, thanks a lot, both, for your talks. First thought that comes to mind is this doesn't look good for the EU. What on earth should we do? But that might be a big question. We'll get to that. I first wanted to start with you, Bart, because you haven't had the chance to say anything yet. So maybe we can still start with this strategy, or at least what the EU says that the strategy is de-risking from China. What is your take on this de-risk as a cybersecurity expert?
Yeah, if you particularly look at the cybersecurity perspective, then China is the bad guy. It's the absolute bad guy for years and years to come. If you look at the year reports of the Dutch intelligence organizations, they explicitly put China consistently at the top when it comes to economic espionage. You showed a nice picture of the J-10 airplane. I don't know if you noticed, it looks very familiar to the F-16. And so next time I would suggest to you to show the J-10 and next to it the picture of the F-16. The J-20, the follow-up plane, looks very similar to the F-35. It's based on stolen models. And this is the way that China has indeed partly built up its position. And from that perspective, China is undermining the Dutch economy, the European economy in a broader sense. The Dutch intelligence organizations see economic espionage as the #1 threat to the Dutch economy. And sorry to say, China is the top leading country in this. So there's a bigger story to tell. I'm not an economist, but this is certainly what I know and see.
Yeah, and so in terms of de-risking, what should or can the EU do in this respect?
Yeah, so with increase its own autonomy, of course.
Yeah.
And this, with respect to China, requires really, really tough measures. I think if you look at Russia, it was difficult to cut our ties with Russia after the invasion of the Ukraine, especially because of the delivery of gas and oil to Europe. But Europe was not dependent on high-tech products from Russia. With China, that is completely different. And there's also a risk in all of this. The big black scenario in this is that China tries to reconquer Taiwan, that this leads to a global conflict. So these are two assumptions, the invasion of Japan and a global conflict coming out of this. This will have very, very big consequences for Europe, because much of the material we need, but also much of the medicines we use come from China. And it's not so easy to replace that. But also Chinese technology has invaded, is part of our infrastructure, that if it comes to a really all-out conflict between China and Europe, people in China can turn the buttons and can turn off some switches, and cars don't run anymore in Europe. Right? The phone system doesn't work anymore in Europe. It really goes far. What can happen at that stage? To really de-risk this is difficult. It's a tremendous effort. This has started maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, when people realized, I think for the first time, very clearly that the Chinese company Huawei is in most of the telecom infrastructure in Europe, and that European governments have said, we don't want Huawei in there, and they've put in some regulation. And this has changed to some extent. So there was a deliberate attempt to try and become more autonomous in this, but this requires, of course, investments. So and the political will to do this.
And that's a hard thing, as you just showed. The political will is lacking.
Yeah, because as you explained very clearly, Europe, certainly European companies are behaving very opportunistically in this.
I want to respond to a few points about just mentioned before. Again, that returning to the point about espionage, I just also admit that this is sort of espionage activities existed, and then again, that's not the whole story. If you just only think this development of J10 is the total copy of F-16, that's really not the case. You just denied the hard work of all these groups of people involved in developing its own technologies and many other things. And then also that why China is stealing technology. It came from a very low technological and economic base, right? And then so hundreds of years of humiliation, and then this anti-Japanese war, and then also many years of civil war, and then the Cultural Revolution, very chaotic, and only began to develop its economy in 1978, when that Europe has already gone through this capital accumulation, and then we all know how that happened, and then also these hundreds of years of industrialization, and then to overcome this historical weakness, and then of course you need to take some measures, right? And then some legitimate, illegitimate measures. I'm also not proud of all those espionage activities, and then that's something that I highly disagree with. But that's again that not the whole story. And also China faced these many years of export controls of its technologies. So during this Cold War, and then it's just even have this China committee, right, so-called committee, and then regulating this technology exports to China, which should have even more stringent rules than exports to Soviet Union. And then that only later on that more sanctions imposed, technologies, the regulations imposed, and then this became one of the not many ways to actually access the technology. And then also about the point of its invasion of Taiwan or Japan, that's not something I agree with. China has very different views when it comes to Taiwan. It sees it as unfinished civil war between this and then which did not finish as a result of U.S. intervention. And then, so when Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and then these two sides make the agreement that, so they are all part of one China. And then, so the disagreement is that which is the legitimate government that represents China. And then according to this UN resolution in 1971, then they're making this PRC the only legitimate government representing China. And then which the country was not finished this reunification unification because of U.S. intervention, which even threatened to use nuclear weapons on China for a certain point. So I just really highly disagree with about this intervention in Taiwan because it's an entirely different matter.
But sorry, I don't know if you want to disagree with me, but I did not say anything about who legitimately rules Taiwan. I only said if China invades or tries to conquer Taiwan, then this and this will happen.
Maybe the situation of Taiwan which is important, but we can put aside for now because I'm sort of curious about you, Angela, because there's clearly a disagreement going on here. What you said is that that the EU should also look at itself, basically, so that
get the house on order. I mean,
you said China is used as an alibi.
Yeah, absolutely, big time. And what we are seeing right now, there's a lot of legislation with the very primitive democratic regime, the architecture that we have in Europe, is swiped off the table in one go in the name of competing with China. We're concluding almost 10 omnibus packages. The first one is in the due diligence directive, which holds companies accountable for whatever happens in their value chain in terms of labor rights and human rights. And this has been dismantled massively right now. We see that with REACH chemicals that were prohibited beforehand, they're now all of a sudden not so dangerous. So then there's one omnibus package, one big deregulation happening that is going to damage us in the name of China. That's the interest of different capital fractions who want to keep accumulating profits to pay that to their shareholders. I'm taking it a bit to the extreme, but we do have a massive problem that European companies are not investing. We have created a financial sector, so circulating, participating, speculating in the financial realm has become more profitable than investing in actual production. We see that also with profits are being used for mergers and acquisitions, not to build, no, to get access to the patents, to the intangibles that you can use as a regular income stream. It's rentierism. So, but we face a more structural problem, and that is capitalism does not grow exponentially. It never grows linearly. It's continuously facing limits and contradictions. And this is referred to as overaccumulation. So whenever that within a given market there's not enough outlets to invest in the productive realm, capital will look for other realms to keep the accumulation going. And that can be the financial sector. It can be mergers and acquisitions. Very important right now, the military-industrial complex. And that's what we're seeing. So we're not investing in better technologies. There's nothing wrong with that. But right now we have the visible hand of the state creating an outlet for overaccumulated capital to keep the accumulation going.
Yeah. So what do you make of this Draghi report, where it's this idea that we have to keep up and that we have to compete with China? What do you make of that? Is that just something that that the idea of competition is what we should get out of our heads?
Absolutely.
What kind of consequences would that have if we
capitalist competition pits capital against capital, capital against labor, and in the presence of a reserve army of the unemployed, labor against labor. It's disuniting more than it unites. So we have to think differently. I mean, we're facing a structural shift. We've been on the top of the food chain for many decades. It's shifting, it's changing. So it's like there's not more investment or more industrial policy that's going to do the trick. I mean, we have to face that we're entering a multipolar order where we cannot keep at the standard where we were before. And we have to think about how we're going to redistribute, like who's going to benefit, who is controlling the innovations and for what purpose, and who's accumulating the profits.
Yeah, but what does that mean for us, for the EU? If we, what does it mean to having to face this new reality?
Let's collectively think about it. So what are the technologies that we might want to put our public money in? And what are the democratic control rights that we're going to get from this? Like, who's going to pick the champions, so-called? Let's have a debate. Let's have a democratic vote on this.
Yeah.
And then also with strings attached. So no shareholder dividend payments whatsoever. 40% of venture capital is public money. There's no public say on where it goes. This is, we're facing major structural contradictions. These are contradictions of capitalism. You cannot understand what's going on right now without getting a sense of how capitalism works and what the crisis potential is of capitalism. I mean, where the discussions, if you follow the mainstream media, it's, we should take on collective debt. It's already happened. We've had taken on 90% of the Next Generation EU program, that's sort of the relief program during the COVID pandemic. Was financed by the EU, who cannot take debt, but the Commission was mandated in the name of the EU member state to retrieve money from the capital markets. This is debt for the Next Generation EU to pay. It's in the name, because the repayment will only start in 36 until 50-something. So it's the next generation that is faces a major debt payment of money that has been spent right now, and in stuff like, I can give like just as an anecdote examples. In Spain, they didn't know what to do with the money, so they got a company and that made selfie sticks for hiking roads. So you can when you're hiking, you can put your mobile phone and then whatever. I don't know how it works. But that type of stuff, sorry. It's anecdotal evidence, but you get the picture.
Yeah.
Collective debt is being used for the mechanism that I tried to outline, InvestEU. That is used, public debt in our names, that is used for financial sector players to issue more debt. So debt sponsoring debt. We're facing a major capitalist crisis because the accumulation of capital, when that gets out of sync with the accumulation of debt, you have a crisis. It's the most simplest explanation of when you enter a capitalist crisis, and we're pumping in debt.
We have so much problems in Europe, but we have to get back to the EU-China relation.
But this is part of the problem for the EU-China relation. So
China has a lot of debt too.
Basically.
China has a lot of debt too.
Yeah, absolutely. So China is moving in the same direction. That might give some relief, because China has a problem of overcapacity.
It needs to find markets. That's what you said. So it dumps its products in Europe and.
Yeah, and there's monetary controls, so savings cannot exit China, but there's not enough investment within China still. So the internal consumer market is not yet up to scale. So China is going through several crises again and again. I mean, there were times when China had like 14-15% GDP growth, and that is gone. I mean, it's. Yeah. And still now China has, in that sense, a stable pillar through exporting right now. So that is really sort of stabilized, but it's very dependent on the export still.
Yeah.
So because the internal economy is not yet developed to consume the products that they're producing. Yeah.
So Guangyu, maybe you can say something about that. How is China sort of looking at this problem, if you can call it that?
Okay, I think I want to start by saying that the overall message I want to convey is quite consistent with Angela's. So I think that Europe now, it's indeed a time to catch up. But there's no point in playing this blaming game, but actually to really reflect on this many of its internal problems, right? And then also admit that China is facing some problems, but also is doing something right as well. And then to kind of also for the EU to really look at maybe pick up some lessons from China as well, and investing in this R&D, and then also this important industries that are really relevant to its future.
But is that what you mean? Because what you said, I think, is that we have to focus on specific industries that are important for us, but also
we need to have a democratic vote on what these industries should be.
Yeah.
So not just
decarbonization.
Don't even. I mean, if you start competing, you've already lost. So, and it's interesting if you take the Latin meaning of the word competere, it means to run and to strive together. It's not like the antagonistic, dividing competition that we have to outcompete. And competition is taking place not with making better products. No, at the end of the day, it's devaluing labor. You need cheap labor to keep up the production. So capitalist competition is affecting labor at the end of the day. At some point, when all the ingredients cannot be reduced or cheapened, it's labor that is seen as a variable production factor. It's a social relation. It's not a production factor, and that's what we're facing. And we're seeing this right now with the omnibus package at the EU, but also what's next around the corner is the 28th regime, corporate legal structure outside of the corporate governance regimes within the EU. So there's just a 28th regime in addition to the 27th one that allows to circumvent labor laws, tax laws, whatsoever, just to make it attractive, to get all the investment. And this is a redistribution conflict that we're facing. If you do not, I mean, you don't have to look at it in the bold categories of capital versus labor, because the different class fractions are internally deeper fractionized. So we have like smaller capitals, we have export-oriented capitals. Car industry doesn't have the same interest as the pharmaceutical industry. So there's different fractions there's with lots of rivalries. And that's what we're seeing right now. There's a struggle like which capital fraction is getting sponsored by the state.
Yeah.
And who's going to lose out.
Yeah, and that's not the thing. That's not what we should do according to your narrative.
We should think about it and then and think about who is reaping the profits of it. How are we going to redistribute the profits?
Yeah. And so, Bart, in your field of cybersecurity, what do you think? So, in terms of this competition, because sometimes you hear that, and this is also Guangyu talked about it. Sort of Europe should focus on R&D, invest, etc. What would that entail in your field? Should Europe invest in sort of its own technology sector more, and what would that look like? Is that possible, especially since, as you just said, that China's such a strong hold on the technology sector also in Europe?
Yeah, but first of all, it's good to make explicit that in the IT sector we do not have a functioning market. And people pretend that this is a market where startups can play a role, etc. But the market is dominated by ultra large powers, American companies mostly, but also a few Chinese big ones, and they perform killer acquisitions. So whenever there's an interesting startup in Europe, they buy it up. If it's useful technology, they incorporate it. If it's technology that threatens them, they buy it and kill the company. This is not a functioning market. There are other aspects why it's not a market. For instance, accountability for failing software has never been realized. The whole sector has managed to get away from that they get damages when they deliver bad products. If you buy whatever household utensil in a shop and it's broken, you go back and you get a new one. You go back with a blue screen. They laugh at you at the window in the shop and say it's your problem. You somewhere signed away that you will hold no one accountable for this. It's not a functioning market where you can get back at the big players. Also, another aspect of it: there's no responsibility for content. Which also really ruins the whole online space. The idea is that there's no responsibility for content in analogy with postal delivery. If I send a letter to you with some nasty material in it, the post office is not responsible because it delivered it to you. The same model has been applied to Facebook. But Facebook has so much manipulative shit on its platform that it should be held responsible for this. And it's not comparable in any way to a letter in a closed letter that they're delivering. So I don't agree with this whole Draghi report that we should build a Silicon Valley in Europe. We should, I think, play on a different chessboard if we want to go into the competition in Europe. Yeah. I think there are two aspects of this. One is really to focus on open source software. To really, for all software development, we should demand, first of all, as public authorities, when we buy software, it must be open source. Public money for public code. That makes it difficult for the big parties to participate in this ecosystem, and it will mean that we will have more local software development. Also, I think we should think about what is often called the steward ownership model. Does anyone know about this steward ownership? It's a company model that in the Anglo-Saxon world it's often called a social company. And so it is legally functions as a company, but all its profits will be dedicated to the specific goals of this company. The legal form does not exist in the Netherlands. There has been a motion in Dutch Parliament asking for adaptation of Dutch laws that such a form of company is also legally established in the Netherlands. It does exist in indirect forms, where you have, for instance, a foundation, and under the foundation a company. So the foundation fully owns the company. All the profits go to the foundation. The foundation decides on how to reinvest this money. There are some big companies in the Netherlands which are organized like this. For instance, the Randstad is, but also several newspapers. I know the Groene Amsterdammer. I don't have a full overview of this. I understand it's popular in Denmark. About 10% of the Danish economy functions like this. And it's a completely different model. And I think it may align very well with the things you are aiming for. Also, when it comes to decarbonization and going for other investment models. And I would be very much in favor that public money goes to such steward ownership organized models instead of this raw capitalism of these investment funds. This is a political decision. And this is something where we, as Europe, could decide otherwise. And, I'm not against company models. I've tried to bring some technology outside the university. It's in the news these last few days. Also, again, this Yifi app. You may have heard this. I tried to set up a foundation outside the university to get this, to let this grow. I noticed in the non-profit sector it doesn't work. I mean, everyone is well willing, but there's no incentive there. The highest level of activity that you find there is planning the next meeting.
For you debunked this fantastic model, totally. Like, I think what you just suggested, we could translate that in so many different sectors.
Yeah, no, sure. So what I'm trying to say with the GV, I also have now somehow in some indirect way realized is what I think we should try to combine in a way is public values with corporate efficiency. And somehow try to incorporate this in good legal models, how companies can function. And I think Europe should play a leading role in this. This will not happen in the US. And in China, I don't know China as a country very well. But that could be a way. That could be a way out of the shit we've ended in, as you described so eloquently.
Yeah. So this is sort of a overarching conclusion is that Europe should really start playing its own game and not follow this same kind of logic, because that will not work. We also don't have the capacity to do it in that way.
Oh, I don't know if you have the capacity, but we should not do it.
Not to follow the same capitalist logic that we don't have the capacity to keep up with all these, with everything, so to speak. That's.
I mean, we've dismantled our industrial capacity, and I mean, you cannot have like global leadership without producing. So. We're a service economy, and that also explains the downward slope of investment. Like if you just need an office and a computer, you have less investment, obviously.
Maybe a final question before we have to get to the audience. Oh, you wanted to respond?
Just a quick comeback. Since you mentioned these open source models, guess who is leading the development of open source models? China. Yeah. So you are still learning from China. Yeah.
This is new to me.
Okay, we'll fight it out at another moment. Maybe a final question. So, Angela, you mentioned that the world is on fire. There's climate change. We have a huge problem. But there's this paradox where the EU is very dependent on China for this green transition, or at least, a lot of technology and rare earths that are necessary for depending on how you see the green transition, but that are necessary for this. Is there a way out of this? Because the dependency is really, really huge.
Yeah, reduced demand.
Yeah.
So we let's not think in growing terms, and we have to invest and more of whatever, because it comes with not only with a giant ecological footprint, but also with labor law and human rights violations. So this is like a very brutal exploitation that's taking place. So and there are replaceables. So let's think in recycling of what we have. Let's be smarter. Let's outsmart the rest of the world. That would be my suggestion.
So don't try to make everything.
Invest in universities and education so that we can have more Radboud Reflects and answer actual questions.
Well.
Because these investments in universities are down. So let's face it, we're investing in military technologies and defense industries.
Invest in universities and Radboud Reflects is a great final remark. Yeah.